Every empire shares the same dangerous belief. Not that it is powerful. Not that it is wealthy. But that it is permanent. At the height of their dominance, empires don't fear collapse. They dismiss it. They treat history as something that happens to other people. Other eras. Other civilizations. Never to them. The Romans believed their legions made them eternal. The British believed their navy guaranteed endless dominance. The Soviets believed their system was scientifically inevitable. Each of them was wrong. And not because they were weak, but because they misunderstood how collapse actually works. Empires don't fall overnight. They don't wake up one morning and realize it's over. They decay quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, while everyday life continues as normal. People still go to work. Markets still open. Politicians still promise stability. That's what makes collapse so dangerous. History doesn't announce the end with a warning siren. It whispers it, slowly, while most people are too busy adapting to notice. What history shows us, again and again, is that the rise and fall of empires follows a pattern. Not a metaphor. Not a theory. A sequence. The names change. The flags change. The technology changes. But the stages remain the same. Expansion leads to confidence. Confidence leads to overreach. Overreach leads to financial strain. Strain leads to economic decay. Economic decay fractures society from within. And once that fracture begins, the final stages arrive faster than anyone expects. Every empire that reached this point believed it was different. That it had broken free from history's rules. That modernity, intelligence, or moral superiority had rewritten the script. None of them escaped. The most unsettling part isn't that empires collapse. It's that people living inside them almost never realize where they are in the cycle. Because each stage feels normal while it's happening. And right now, the United States is not at the beginning of this story. It is deep inside it. In this video, we're going to break down the 7 stages of imperial collapse. The same sequence that ended Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union, and why America is already past the point most people think collapse begins. This isn't history for curiosity's sake. It's history as a warning. Because when empires fall, they don't just disappear. They take stability, wealth, and futures with them. And the people who survive aren't the ones who trust the system the most. They're the ones who recognize the pattern early. Let's begin at the first stage, where every empire believes the future belongs to them. Every empire begins the same way, with momentum. This is the stage where power feels limitless, where growth feels natural, where success feels deserved. Expansion isn't questioned, it's celebrated. New territories, new markets, new influence. Victories reinforce the belief that the system works better than all others. This is when empires stop seeing themselves as one nation among many, and start seeing themselves as the center of history. Spain experienced this in the 1500s, when silver from the Americas flooded Europe and made Madrid the financial heart of the world. Britain felt it in the 1700s, as its navy dominated global trade routes and its flag appeared on every map. The Soviet Union reached it after World War II, when half of Europe fell under its control and nuclear parity made it untouchable. And the United States entered this stage after 1945. America emerged from World War II with its cities intact, its industry dominant, and its currency installed as the backbone of the global system. It didn't just win the war, it wrote the rules of the world that followed. Military bases on every continent. Control over global finance. Cultural influence unmatched in human history. For decades, everything reinforced the same belief. This system was not only powerful, it was final. During this stage, citizens internalize a powerful idea. That expansion isn't a choice, it's destiny. The economy grows. The military wins. The future looks inevitable. And that's exactly what makes this stage so dangerous. Because confidence slowly transforms into arrogance. And arrogance blinds empires to limits. Success convinces leaders that every problem can be solved the same way, with more reach, more force, more commitments. One more alliance. One more intervention. One more responsibility abroad. Each decision feels reasonable on its own. But taken together, they quietly push the empire toward the next phase. Because no system, no matter how powerful, has infinite resources. And that's when expansion turns into something far more dangerous. Overstretch. In the next part, we'll look at how empires cross the invisible line between strength and self-destruction, and why they almost never realize it until it's too late. Overstretch doesn't announce itself as a mistake. It disguises itself as responsibility, as leadership, as the burden of maintaining order. At first, it feels like strength. An empire responds to one crisis, then another. An ally needs protection. A region becomes unstable. A rival challenges influence. Each time the decision feels justified. One more deployment. One more base. One more long-term commitment. And because the empire is still powerful, nothing breaks immediately. That's the trap. Spain fell into overstretch when it tried to fight wars across Europe while governing colonies from the Americas to Asia. Britain reached it when it attempted to police a quarter of the world with a population smaller than a modern megacity. The Soviet Union crossed that line when it tried to match American military spending while propping up regimes across the globe. In every case, the logic was the same. Retreat would look like weakness. So they expanded instead. But overstretch isn't about losing battles. It's about spreading capacity too thin. Every new obligation requires money, manpower, logistics, and attention. And those resources have to come from somewhere. Gradually, the empire stops shaping events and starts reacting to them. It moves from planning the future to managing crises. Fire after fire. Region after region. Nothing ever feels catastrophic, just exhausting. This is where the United States quietly crossed a critical threshold. After the Cold War, instead of consolidating its position, America expanded its security commitments. NATO moved east. Wars were launched in the Middle East. Defense guarantees multiplied across Europe and Asia. Today, the U.S. maintains hundreds of overseas bases and commitments to defend dozens of nations simultaneously. On paper, it looks like dominance. In reality, it's fragility. Because overstretch creates a simple but fatal problem. The empire becomes unable to concentrate power where it matters most. Every crisis competes with every other crisis. Every conflict drains readiness from the next. And while overstretch alone doesn't collapse empires, it sets the stage for something far more dangerous. A moment when the cost can no longer be hidden. A moment when the math stops working. That moment is called fiscal crisis. And once it begins, the clock starts ticking. In the next part, we'll see how empires attempt to pay for the impossible, and why those attempts always make the collapse worse. Empires rarely collapse because they lose power. They collapse because they can no longer afford it. A fiscal crisis begins quietly. Budgets still pass. Governments still function. Markets still operate. But beneath the surface, the numbers stop making sense. This is the moment when the cost of maintaining the empire grows faster than the economy that supports it. Spain reached this point in the late 1500s. Silver continued to arrive from the Americas, yet it was never enough. Wars in Europe consumed everything. Spain declared bankruptcy again, and again, and again. Britain crossed this line after World War I. Victory came at an unbearable price. The empire survived on paper, but its finances never recovered. From that moment on, decline became unavoidable. The Soviet Union hit fiscal crisis in the 1980s. Competing militarily with the United States consumed an enormous share of its economy. The system didn't collapse immediately, but it became hollow. This is how fiscal crisis works. The empire doesn't suddenly run out of money. Instead, it starts borrowing from the future. Debt replaces growth. Printing replaces productivity. Promises replace reality. Every solution creates a larger problem. Borrowing shifts the burden to the next generation. Money creation erodes purchasing power. Higher taxes slow the economy that's already struggling. And eventually, interest alone becomes a crushing weight. This is where the United States stands today. The national debt has exploded over the past 2 decades. Trillions are borrowed not to build the future, but simply to keep the system functioning. Interest payments now rival, and in some cases exceed, core government spending priorities. The empire is borrowing to pay interest on money it already borrowed. At the same time, military commitments remain untouched. Global obligations remain intact. The footprint remains enormous. This is the defining feature of fiscal crisis. No political path exists that doesn't make the problem worse. Cut spending and stability cracks. Raise taxes and growth stalls. Print money and inflation eats away at trust. So leaders delay. They manage appearances. They hope time solves what mathematics will not. But fiscal crisis is not the end. It is the bridge. Because an empire can survive debt. But it cannot survive when debt begins to undermine the real economy. That's when stagnation replaces progress. That's when opportunity disappears. That's when the next stage begins. Economic decline. And once an empire loses its economic edge, everything else starts to unravel. In the next part, we'll look at how empires hollow out from within, and why decline feels so ordinary while it's happening. Economic decline rarely feels like collapse. It feels like disappointment. Growth doesn't disappear. it slows. Jobs don't vanish, they get worse. Prosperity doesn't end, it becomes uneven. This is the stage where people begin to sense that something is wrong, but can't quite name it. Spain experienced this in the 1600s. A flood of silver created inflation that destroyed domestic industry. Wealth existed but productivity collapsed. Britain entered this phase when its industrial dominance was overtaken by faster, more efficient competitors. The Soviet Union felt it when innovation stalled and consumer shortages became permanent. In every case, the symptoms were the same. Manufacturing moved elsewhere. Infrastructure aged without replacement. Currencies weakened. Young people struggled to build stable lives. The future stopped feeling larger than the present. This is the moment when the empire's greatest advantage, its economy, begins to fail it. And once that happens, power becomes harder to sustain. The United States has been living through this phase for years. Manufacturing shifted overseas. Real wages stagnated. Infrastructure decayed. Productivity gains slowed. While rivals invested in long-term growth, America relied on financialization and debt to maintain the appearance of prosperity. The system still functions, but it no longer inspires confidence. This is where expectations break. Parents begin to doubt their children will be better off. Workers lose faith that effort leads to security. Citizens question whether the system still rewards contribution. And that doubt matters. Because economic decline doesn't just weaken balance sheets. It weakens social trust. When people stop believing the future will improve, they stop cooperating. They stop sacrificing. They start competing against each other. This is where economic decline transforms into something far more dangerous. Internal fracture. Because when an empire can no longer unite its population through prosperity, it begins to divide them through conflict. And that brings us to the most visible and most destabilizing stage of all. Social and political fragmentation. This is the stage where collapse becomes impossible to ignore. And it's where the United States stands today. In the next part, we'll look at how societies tear themselves apart from the inside, and why this stage feels like chaos, not decline. This is the stage where decline stops being abstract. You can feel it. Social and political fragmentation is the moment when an empire begins to turn inward, not to heal but to fight itself. At this stage, the greatest threat is no longer external rivals. It's internal distrust. The shared identity that once held society together starts to dissolve. Institutions lose legitimacy. Consensus becomes impossible. Politics stops being about solving problems and becomes about defeating enemies. History is brutally consistent here. Spain reached this phase in the 1600s when regions like Catalonia and Portugal rejected Madrid's authority. The idea of a shared imperial project collapsed, replaced by resentment and rebellion. Britain experienced fragmentation after World War I. Labor strikes paralyzed the country. Ireland broke away. Class conflict replaced national unity. The Soviet Union entered this stage in the 1980s. Communist ideology lost credibility. Ethnic republics asserted independence. Moscow's authority weakened, not because of invasion but because belief vanished. This is what fragmentation looks like. Political disagreement becomes existential. Opposition is treated as treason. Elections are viewed as illegitimate by whoever loses. Trust evaporates, in government, in courts, in media, even in fellow citizens. People stop identifying as members of one nation and start defining themselves by tribe. Political, cultural, racial, regional, economic. And once that happens, cooperation becomes impossible. This is where the United States stands today. Polarization has reached levels unseen in generations. Political parties no longer disagree on policy, they question each other's right to rule. Institutions are seen not as neutral arbiters, but as weapons controlled by the other side. States pass laws that openly defy federal authority. Citizens consume entirely separate realities. Families fracture along ideological lines. Protests and unrest become routine. Violence becomes normalized. Dialogue disappears. And here's the most dangerous part. Fragmentation convinces each side that collapse would only hurt the other. That illusion is fatal. Because while citizens fight each other, the structural problems remain untouched. Debt grows. Infrastructure decays. External rivals advance. The empire loses its ability to respond coherently to crises. This stage doesn't guarantee collapse, but it makes recovery incredibly rare. Because to reverse decline, a society must act together. And fragmentation makes unity politically impossible. History shows that once an empire reaches this point, only two paths remain. reform so dramatic it feels revolutionary, or distraction so extreme it becomes catastrophic. Which is why the next stage is almost always the same. A final attempt to assert strength. A moment when declining empires lean on the last tool they believe still works: military power. In the next part, we'll see how overextension and internal division collide, and why military failure often becomes the psychological breaking point of empire. When empires can no longer hold themselves together through prosperity, they turn to the one force they believe still commands respect: power. More specifically, military power. This stage is not about ambition. It's about fear. A declining empire doesn't use force to expand. It uses force to prove it's still relevant. History leaves little room for interpretation. Spain entered this stage in the mid-1600s when its overstretched armies suffered decisive defeats in Europe. The myth of Spanish invincibility shattered, and once it did, the empire unraveled rapidly. Britain reached this point during World War II. Victory came only with outside help. The war exposed a truth Britain could no longer hide: it could not defend its empire alone. Global dominance ended not with surrender, but with realization. The Soviet Union hit this stage in Afghanistan. What was meant to be a demonstration of strength became a grinding, unwinnable conflict that revealed systemic weakness. The psychological damage was irreversible. This is the defining feature of Stage 6. It's not just about losing wars. It's about losing belief. When a superpower fails militarily, the signal is heard everywhere. Allies begin to doubt. Rivals become bolder. Neutral states start preparing for a different future. But most importantly, citizens lose faith. They stop believing their government can protect them. They stop believing sacrifice is worth it. They stop believing the system works. The United States has not fully entered this stage yet. But the warning signs are no longer subtle. Long wars that ended without victory. Withdrawals that damaged credibility. Rising rivals who no longer fear deterrence. Military readiness strained by endless commitments. Recruitment falling. Public support eroding. And above all, a dangerous imbalance between commitments and capacity. History shows that empires rarely choose the moment of military reckoning. It arrives when multiple crises collide. And when that moment comes, the outcome doesn't just reshape borders. It reshapes reality. Because once the illusion of invincibility is gone, the final stage begins. Not with an explosion, but with exhaustion. Collapse is not chaos at first. It is resignation. This is the stage where maintaining the old system costs more than abandoning it. Where resources meant for renewal are consumed by attempts to preserve something that no longer works. Spain's imperial system collapsed and was replaced by a smaller, inward-focused state. Britain dismantled its empire and handed global leadership to someone else. The Soviet Union dissolved almost overnight once belief disappeared. Stage 7 looks different every time. Sometimes it's revolution. Sometimes it's fragmentation. Sometimes it's quiet transformation. But the outcome is always the same. The old order ends. What makes this stage inevitable is not ideology or leadership failure. It's mathematics. When an empire extracts more from its people than it gives back, security, opportunity, stability, it becomes unsustainable. Citizens stop building the future. They start fighting over what remains. The system feeds on itself until nothing is left to feed on. The United States has not reached this final stage. But the trajectory is clear. Each stage has followed the last with precision. Expansion. Overstretch. Debt. Economic erosion. Internal fracture. Only 2 stages remain. And history offers no example of an empire that stopped the sequence once it reached this point. Every empire believed it was the exception. Every empire believed it had more time. Every empire was wrong. This is not about panic. It's about awareness. Because when empires fall, they don't take abstract concepts with them. They take savings, security, futures. The people who survive collapse aren't the most loyal to the system. They're the ones who understand the pattern early and prepare accordingly. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with deadly accuracy. And right now, the rhyme is unmistakable. If you want to understand how power, money, and systems really rise and fall, and what that means for your future, subscribe to Finance Archives. Because history has already written the ending. The only question is whether you see it coming.